Article 445.18 requires a disconnect for generator conductors feeding branch circuits unless certain exceptions apply. Exception 1 applies if the generator is rated 30 amps or less and is not used to supply continuous loads. Exception 2 applies if the generator is part of a listed system that provides its own disconnect and overcurrent protection. Based on the wording of the code, a separate disconnect is only required if the generator does not meet one of these exceptions. If the generator has its own disconnect that is readily accessible, a second disconnect would not be necessary. The key terms here are readily accessible and continuous load. Readily accessible means capable of being reached quickly for operation, renewal, or inspections, without requiring those to whom ready access is requisite to climb over or remove obstacles or to resort to portable ladders, and so forth. A continuous load is a load where the maximum current is expected to continue for 3 hours or more. Here's a more in-depth look at each exception. Firstly, exception 1 regarding generators rated 30 amps or less and not supplying continuous loads. This exception recognizes that smaller generators used for temporary power and not for extended periods pose a low risk and may not warrant a separate disconnect. The 30 amp rating refers to the generator's output capacity. If a generator is rated higher than 30 amps, this exception does not apply. The not used to supply continuous loads clause is crucial. If the generator powers loads that operate for 3 hours or more, even if the generator is rated 30 amps or less, a separate disconnect is required. This is because prolonged operation increases the risk of overheating or other electrical hazards. An example of a situation where this exception might apply is a small portable generator used to power tools at a construction site for short durations. If the total load is under 30 amps and the generator is not running continuously for 3 hours or more, a separate disconnect might not be required. However, this is always subject to the interpretation of the authority having jurisdiction. Secondly, exception 2 pertains to generators that are part of a listed system providing its own disconnect and overcurrent protection. This exception acknowledges that some generator systems are designed and tested as a complete unit and include built-in safety features. Listed means that the generator system has been evaluated by a recognized testing laboratory, such as Underwriters Laboratories or Intertek, and found to comply with relevant safety standards. These listed systems often incorporate a disconnect switch and overcurrent protection devices such as circuit breakers or fuses within the generator enclosure or as part of a control panel. The disconnect switch allows for safe isolation of the generator from the load in case of maintenance or emergencies, and the overcurrent protection devices prevent damage from overload or short circuits. If a generator system is listed and includes these features, a separate disconnect switch might not be required, as the system is already designed to provide adequate safety. For instance, a standby generator system installed at a commercial building might be a listed system with an automatic transfer switch that includes a disconnect and overcurrent protection. In this case, a separate disconnect switch at the generator might not be necessary. However, even if the generator meets one of these exceptions, the authority having jurisdiction has the final say. It is always recommended to consult with a local electrical inspector or building official to determine the specific requirements in your area. Inspectors may have different interpretations of the code based on local conditions or policies. It is important to understand what constitutes a readily accessible disconnect. The National Electrical Code defines readily accessible as being capable of being reached quickly for operation, renewal, or inspections without requiring those to whom ready access is requisite to climb over or remove obstacles or to resort to portable ladders, and so forth. This means the disconnect must be easily reachable without any obstructions. The disconnect should not be behind locked doors, in high locations requiring a ladder, or in areas that are difficult to access. If the generator's disconnect is not readily accessible, a separate disconnect that meets this requirement may be necessary. Considering authority having jurisdiction interpretations, it is important to understand that electrical codes, including the National Electrical Code, are subject to interpretation by local authorities. Electrical inspectors, building officials, and other authorities having jurisdiction have the responsibility of enforcing the code and ensuring that the electrical installations are safe. These authorities may have different interpretations of the code based on local conditions, experience, or policies. In some cases, an inspector may require a separate disconnect even if the generator appears to meet one of the exceptions in Article 445.18. This could be due to specific safety concerns or a stricter interpretation of the code. It is always best to communicate with the authority having jurisdiction early in the project to understand their requirements and avoid potential conflicts later on. If an inspector insists on a disconnect, even if you believe it is not required, it may be necessary to install one to comply with the local regulations. In such cases, it is important to document the situation and obtain written clarification from the authority having jurisdiction to avoid similar issues in the future. When installing a disconnect switch for a generator, there are several factors to consider. The disconnect switch must be rated for the voltage and current of the generator circuit. It should be suitable for the environment in which it is installed, such as wet or corrosive locations. The disconnect switch should be clearly labeled to indicate its purpose. It should be installed in a readily accessible location, as defined by the National Electrical Code. The disconnect switch should be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions and all applicable electrical codes. Here are some best practices to keep in mind. Firstly, always consult with the authority having jurisdiction. Before installing a generator, always consult with the local electrical inspector or building official to determine the specific requirements in your area. Secondly, understand the National Electrical Code requirements. Familiarize yourself with Article 445.18 and other relevant sections of the National Electrical Code to ensure compliance. Thirdly, choose a listed generator system. If possible, select a generator system that is listed and includes its own disconnect and overcurrent protection. Fourthly, ensure readily accessible disconnects. Make sure that any disconnect switches are readily accessible and clearly labeled. Fifthly, document everything. Keep records of all inspections, approvals, and communications with the authority having jurisdiction. Finally, prioritize safety. Always prioritize safety when working with electrical equipment. If you are not qualified to install or maintain a generator, hire a licensed electrician. Let's consider some practical examples. Example 1. A homeowner installs a 7 kilowatt portable generator to power their home during a power outage. The generator is connected to the home's electrical system through a manual transfer switch. The generator is rated 30 amps and is not used to supply continuous loads. In this case, a separate disconnect switch at the generator might not be required as it meets the exception in Article 445.18. However, the authority having jurisdiction may still require a disconnect based on local conditions. Example 2. A commercial building installs a 100 kilowatt standby generator system to provide backup power during outages. The generator system is listed and includes an automatic transfer switch with a disconnect and overcurrent protection. In this case, a separate disconnect switch at the generator might not be necessary, as the system is already designed to provide adequate safety. Example 3. A construction site uses a 50 kilowatt generator to power tools and equipment. The generator runs continuously for more than 3 hours at a time. In this case, a separate disconnect switch at the generator is required, as it does not meet the exception for continuous loads. In summary, Article 445.18 of the National Electrical Code requires a disconnect for generator conductors feeding branch circuits unless certain exceptions apply. Exception 1 covers generators rated 30 amps or less that do not supply continuous loads, while Exception 2 applies to listed systems with their own disconnect and overcurrent protection. Always consult with the authority having jurisdiction to determine the specific requirements in your area and ensure that all electrical installations are safe and compliant.